Well, hello, beautiful people, and welcome back to M4L Academy. I'm Missy Karwowski, Director of M4LA, and I'm so glad that you've joined us today as we tackle education technology. You know, those laptops, one-on-one devices, tablets, and now, yes, even artificial intelligence. It's all swept through the schools over the past 2 decades. And, we were promised that these digital wonders would transform learning, make our kids smarter, and maybe even help them leap tall buildings in a single bound. But what if the reality is a little less super and a lot more sobering? Well, our guest, Dr. Cooney Horvath, is a neuroscientist, educator, and author who's spent years unpacking the science of learning, and he's about to help us understand it too. He'll help us understand why, despite all the hype and billions spent, EdTech might actually be hurting our kids' learning a lot more than helping it. Through eye-opening research from around the world, combined with decades of brain science, he challenges the assumption that more tech and more screens must equate to better learning. Instead, he reminds us why human connection, focus, and deep thinking are still the real superheroes in education. So let's dive in. Welcome back to class. Welcome to the program, Dr. Cooney Horvath.
Thank you so much. And I loved that introduction. You had some really, really good ways of kind of framing all this. I like that a lot.
Well, I think you do a fantastic job of the way you frame this entire situation, the scenario, because you take it and you take down these very complex ideas and make it very understandable. So I really appreciate that. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, first of all, and what got you motivated to look at this stuff?
Absolutely. So I was a teacher originally back in the day, about 2 decades ago. So believe it or not, teaching is my passion. That's all I ever really wanted to do. But back when I was teaching, that was the decade of the brain. So I figured, all right, if I go and learn about the brain, I'll be a better teacher. And I thought that'd be like a year or two of my life, but that's how I got stuck in academia doing neuroscience for now 20 years. Once you start, you really can't leave. But that whole time I study what's called the science of learning. Basically, how do human beings learn? How does memory work? How does attention work? And I've worked with schools for decades now to say, cool, if this is how learning works, what do we do as teachers? What do we do as students? And it's only really been in about the last 5 years that that's been morphing into, why aren't kids learning very well these days? And that's where the tech stuff has really come in to say, look, if we know how learning works, we can ask, does the tool align with that? And if the answer is no, maybe that's one of the answers to the questions we're asking about why kids are struggling right now.
I think that's really important. There is such a focus on this idea that more screens equals better learning, right? But that clearly is not a flawed assumption. And was there a pivotal turning point that made you start looking at that?
No, it was very weird. I ran a study, this would have been probably like 10 years ago, where we were looking at binge watching behavior. So that was when like Netflix was the new kind of popular thing going around. And we
Guilty
found
of
that,
binge watching right
well,
here.
that's it. We were all doing it. And that's it. And you may have realized that in the last couple of years, places like Netflix and stuff have stopped releasing entire seasons simultaneously. It's because our research was showing binge watching was actually harming your understanding, your learning, your enjoyment for the show. So people who binge watch don't understand as much and they like the shows less. So they were like, well, if we're investing millions of dollars in TV shows, let's put it out nightly or weekly in a way that people are going to actually start to remember them. So it kind of started as a fluke where I was just looking at that question. Do we learn better when we binge versus not? And that tech just kept expanding into more and more aspects of ed tech to say, well, it's not just Netflix. It's what about Duolingo? What about computers? What about one-to-one laptops? And it all kind of ballooned from there. And I think an important thing to remember as we go through this today, especially, is I'm going to be coming from an angle of pro learning. That's all I care about is learning. I am not anti-tech. Believe, like, people will immediately say, oh, you're anti-tech, you're a Luddite. Cool, call me whatever you want to. No, I'm just pro learning. If tech helped learning, I'd be the first one to say use it. It just doesn't. So most of what I'm going to argue is you'll see it's the reason why the data is so bad is because if you better understand how humans learn, you can adapt to that learning. You can make learning easier for them. And tech just doesn't do it that way.
So one of the things before we really get started on too far into that, I want to define some terms because a lot of times nowadays screens, the conversation revolves, of course, for the obvious reason around like mental health concerns and issues like that. But you highlight learning outcomes and how there's a detrimental effect on learning. So I heard it challenged recently in a book that I read, not from a specific person, but in the book Rewiring Education.
Yeah.
There was a bit of a challenge proposed that learning outcomes are really only measured by essentially standardized tests, which I'm going to be completely frank, I'm not entirely sure of all the different ways that we measure learning outcomes. Is that the primary way that we do it, through like standardized tests?
Yeah, yes and no. Yes, in the sense of if you're looking at large scale comparable data amongst countries, so like worldwide data, we're most likely going to lean on standardized tests. But when you get into academic research, and so we're talking about tens of thousands of studies, that's going to be defined completely differently. The outcome could be a test, it could be a piece of artwork, it could be a measure of engagement. So the big comparable stuff will say yes, but you can really get nuanced if you want to get into the weeds on that. But I guess I'll pull that back, is there will be some people who naturally say, well, standardized test doesn't measure deep learning. It only measures what we know versus what we can do. But you got to
Mhm.
remember, what you know determines what you can do. So if you fail a surface level standardized test of knowledge, I guarantee you 100% you will fail a deep level test on applying that knowledge. So you can't get to deep level learning without first passing through the surface. So we can have a debate on whether or not standardized tests are meaningful or not, because they're only looking at the surface. But it is 100% correlation. If you don't do well on that, you won't do well on deeper stuff. So we can at least draw that line. And I will point out, just as an example of that, 2019, 63 different countries took a test on knowledge, science, math, writing, and a test on creativity. Hands down, the country that outperformed everyone on knowledge was Singapore, which comes as a surprise to most nobody because their education system is so hard. What surprised everyone is, guess who came out on top on all tests of creativity? Singapore. Why?
Hmm.
Because the more you know, the more you can do with that. Things like creativity, critical thinking always correlate almost perfectly with knowledge. So that's why we say, even if it is just standardized tests, that does give us insight into what we can expect from our kids as well.
So, would it be fair to say it's like saying you have to have the foundation of the knowledge before you can really go further? That's essentially it,
Bingo.
right?
And you start to see that bleeds right into one of the big arguments tech makes when they say you don't need to know stuff because you can
Oh,
access it. You don't need to know things, you can just look it up. Unfortunately, looking up access to information is very different than embedding it. The way deep learning works, things like creativity, critical thinking, it requires that knowledge is in you, not simply that you can look it up in a book. So when tech tries to say we don't need to, we can skip that whole first phase of learning, there is nothing after that. So you do need the foundations if you ever want to get deeper with it.
that absolutely boggles my mind. I just have to say real quick that there is even an argument being made by anybody that oh sure, we can just skip this part of learning. I mean, it seems so basic and completely logical.
Yeah.
So now, then, what we're seeing, I believe, right, is that Gen Z and Gen Alpha are showing the first measured cognitive declines versus prior generations, which is pretty crazy because we're in school longer and learning more things than ever.
Yeah.
Where are we seeing these statistics? Can you show some of that?
Oh man, you will see it across the board. So if you just want to go pure cognitive, every generation have improved on their parents on measures of memory, of attention, general intelligence, sustain, self control. Every generation has been better than their parents on these cognitive measures. And that's exactly what we want. We want kids that are faster, better, smarter than we are. Gen Z is the first generation to dip on all those. There's a thing called the reverse Flynn effect, where for century we've seen everyone go up. Now in the Western countries anyway, it's now plateaued and it's starting to dip, where now kids have worse memory than their parents, worse attention than their parents, lower IQ than their parents. And Gen Alpha is doing a little bit worse than them. So we're now going down for the first time ever. And how does that then manifest? If you look at tests, if you look at learning, it becomes really difficult sometimes to spot this because researchers do what's called renorming. Basically, let's say we all as adults take a test today, and then our kids all take the same test. If they score significantly higher or lower than us, in order to make our two tests comparable, what they're going to do is just smush the two tests together. They're either going to give our kids extra points to make it look like they're the same, or take away points from them to make it look the same. Basically, they're going to take two different measures, and so we can compare it, they're going to renorm it and just kind of push it up to say it looks equivalent. So they renorm every test. So every year looks about the same. If you really want to see what's going on, you have to find the raw data before they've changed it. And one of the places we've seen it on the SATs, kids are dropping up to 20 to 30 points per decade now on the SATs compared to where they were before. And that's pure, but you wouldn't see it because they just renorm it. And one of the biggest tests is called the PISA. So that's the big international test. About 90 countries take the PISA exam. That tests things like math, science, all that. And every year, they do it about every 3 years, looks about the same. But if you look at the raw data, every year we're dropping 15 to 25 points, which means the difference between, say, kids who were taking it in 2000 and now, that's the difference between the 50th percentile and, say, the 32nd percentile. But you will never see it because they just boost the new kids up. So it looks like they're learning the same as the old kids. So they're doing their best to make it so we can't notice these changes, but they're there. If you get into the research, if you get into the labs, it's there.
That is so frustrating because is it fair that grade inflation would fall into this renorming, the normalization of it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there
Well,
are,
you think it, that's why one of the weirdest things with grades is it becomes completely incomparable in that I think it's something like between 2010 and now, 11% more kids are earning A's. 17 fewer percent kids are failing. But if you look on standardized test scores, they're all going down. So somehow our grades are going up while our knowledge, our ability, our tests, our cognitive tests are going down. So the grades have become something of like they're cute, but we can't really use those for research anymore.
They're completely pointless. In which I jokingly say that I'm not very competitive. Everyone who knows me apparently says that I am. I only think that I'm really competitive when it comes to academia. Like, give me a Kahoot or an extra credit question, and by golly, I'm going to be all over that. But other things, like, I'm not the fastest runner. I definitely am not the fastest biker. I'm not going to do any of that. But I'm going to get every question right and then some on my test. So with my kids, when they were going through school, I was just shocked at some of their performance. And then they're coming back with great grades still.
Yeah.
And I was completely flummoxed. I had no idea. I had no explanation for it. I assumed there was some version of grade inflation because, I don't know, it just seems logical. But I didn't think it was actually as bad as it was.
You know what blew it up? COVID. So in Washington State, and I'm not singling out anyone. Yes, I am clearly Washington State, but they made it illegal to fail a kid during COVID. So basically, Fs went to nothing. You legally could not fail a kid because it would harm them. Everyone comes back to school, and now like only 2% of kids are failing, and something like 60% of kids are getting A's. They kept it for whatever reason, they changed it during COVID. When they came back to schools, they basically just kept it that we're not going to fail you because it's going to hurt your feelings, and we're going to pass everyone. I get it. Like, I totally understand the emotional resonance of these things, but it's made grades basically irrelevant when it comes to understanding what our kids know and what we can do.
Yeah, it is. It's very unfortunate because kids still need that. Our children still need an actual standard to work against.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I derailed a bit because that one just really,
I love this stuff.
Truly. So these statistics obviously are extremely concerning. I mean, all around the world, definitely. Clearly, we're focused more in our country. But supposedly we were promised, of course, years ago that these devices are going to help student outcomes, student learning. But clearly the data indicates that is not happening. So how can you explain why this is happening? Like, why are these gains not being realized?
Yeah, I'd say there's really dozens of small explanations, but there's three what I'm going to call intractable explanations. These are things that so long as tech exists as it always exists, they'll never be able to overcome them. The first concerns attention. So the key to all learning is focused attention. And one of the best ways to kill attention is multitasking. Believe it or not, the human brain cannot tackle more than one focused task at a time. By all means, you can walk and talk, but that's because you're not paying attention to walking. But if you want to try and pay attention to two things, the brain basically has to reset itself and quickly jump between the two things. So believe it or not, in academia, we do not accept that multitasking even exists. We call it task switching. People don't do two things at once. They do two things separately and just really quickly switch. The problem is every time you switch, you start to go slower, your brain starts to get confused, so your accuracy drops. And for whatever reason, we don't know why, your brain will start using a secondary memory system when you're multitasking. So your memories become basically unusable. So if you multitask while you learn, you go slower, your accuracy drops, and your memory tanks. It's like the worst thing you can do for learning. Cut to technology.
Yeah.
So now we put a kid in front of a screen and we say, all right, kids, time to learn. You got to remember, kids post COVID since 2023, teens and tweens age 8 to 18 spend over 2,500 hours every single year. That's over 100 days doing nothing but multitasking on screens. They jump between tabs and they talk to their friends and they go to YouTube and all this. And I have the official numbers if you want them, I can send them. But now when we say time to learn, most of them will only make it about 6 minutes before they jump back to what they know, which is multitask. Open this tab, talk to my friend. And so we call this the intractable problem of primary function. If tech only ever existed in schools and was only ever understood as a learning tool, may have been the most powerful thing we have. But the second they entered the home, and more importantly, the pocket, human beings stopped seeing them as learning tools and started seeing them as entertainment tools. Now, when we try and shoehorn in the function of learning, most human beings cannot overcome that obstacle, and they go right back to doing the number one thing you can't do when I need you to learn. So that's why, like, people say chalkboards. What else is a kid going to do with a chalkboard but learn? But if a chalkboard entered the home and kids started playing on chalkboards and stuff, they would no longer be learning tools. So so long as in the battle of entertainment and education, entertainment won, and the more we try and pretend as though these tools are somehow not entertainment tools, we're just making a mistake and kids can't quite grasp that. The second issue has to do then with empathy. So this is going to sound a little strange, but empathy. No human being has empathy. You do not have it. I do not have it. Empathy is not an emotion like joy or happiness. All emotions are personal. Empathy, by its very definition, is transpersonal, and we can measure it. So I'll never be able to measure your happiness, but I can measure empathy. When two people start to interact, their bodies will begin to synchronize. They will begin to breathe at the same rate. They will begin to blink simultaneously. Their hearts will start to beat at the same time. If I could image their brains start to sync up. That is empathy. We define empathy as biological synchrony between two people, and it's a very measurable thing. Why does any of this matter? Human beings have developed for 150,000 years to develop empathy. It turns out empathy is our primary learning mechanism. When we begin to empathize with another human being, we begin to learn from them because in a very real sense, we start to think like them in that moment. They know how to pull us over struggle. We get motivated by that. Empathy is one of the key drivers to all learning. Empathy requires two pairs of biology syncing up. What is one thing technology simply does not have?
Biology.
Biology. Bingo. It doesn't have a brain. It doesn't have a heart. It doesn't have a brain or lungs. So by definition, you can't empathize. So an entire aspect of learning, one of the key drivers of learning we know that we've developed hundreds of thousand years to have, we will never be able to get from a machine. It just ignores that completely, which is why dropout rates for online courses are around like 85%. Once you start learning online, as soon as it gets to the first struggle spot, you have no empathy to pull you through, no one to resonate with. So you just quit. You go, well, that was fun. And you know it. If you've ever done an online course, you never finished it. No one ever does because online learning isn't how we learn. So that's the second thing, the empathy. That's why teachers, by the way, will always matter. We learn from each other. We do not learn from things. The third issue then, this one, just give me a second, is going to be a little tricky, but it's important. It's a concept called transfer. Basically, transfer says, how do we move knowledge and skills between different contexts, right? So like I'm a teacher, I teach my kids math. I'm glad you can do math in my classroom. I want you to be able to transfer it to home so you can do math when you're balancing your bills, maybe to work so you can balance a checkbook, whatever that is over there. We want you to be able to move your skills beyond school. So that's called transfer. Now, there are two things to know about transfer. First, all learning is highly contextual. So believe it or not, right now, us talking, your memory for this situation isn't going to be my words. It'll be my words mixed with the feeling of that chair against your body, whatever temperature might be in the air right now, anything you might be smelling, other things you're hearing. Go inside. Are you happy? Are you sad? Are you hungry? Are you tired? All of this context will get tied up in what you're learning right now, and that will ultimately determine how you can access this learning later. This is why military, when they train for combat, they don't sit down and play like Call of Duty 12 hours a day. They train high tension, high stress, live ammo, full combat situations. Why?
Mhm.
Because what's a war situation like? High tension, high stress, live ammo. They build context into the learning, so when they hit that context later, it's more easy for them to access that learning. In a very real way, if you study in a red room and then take a test in a green room, you will do worse than if you took a test in a red room. How the context matters. So this means when kids learn online, they will be tying that learning to an incredibly narrow context, a screen. The screen, believe it or not, is not a wide, it's not a varied context. It is locked down. So anytime kids learn online, you will see them unable to move that learning easily offline. You just showed me you could do it on a Kahoot. Why can't you do it in this quiz over here? Because I've got this context issue. Now, rightly, some listeners will point out, well, that knife is going to cut both ways. If I learn online and try and move it offline, I'm going to take a context hit. But if I learn offline and try and move it online, I'm going to take the same context hit. Touche, you absolutely will, until you recognize the second dimension of transfer. The next dimension of transfer is called additive versus subtractive. So this basically says sometimes when you move a skill, you need to do more than what you initially learned to make that skill work in the new situation. We call that additive. Sometimes you have to do less than what you initially learned. Your learning was harder than the performance. We call that subtractive. So here's an example. Imagine you grew up driving a manual transmission car. That's how I trained on a manual transmission car. Now someone pops you in an automatic. Well, shoot, automatic is much easier than a manual. I have to do less. It becomes the easiest thing in the world. Subtractive transfer is basically automatic. It's easy as heck. But flip it. If you learned how to drive on an automatic, and now I put you in a manual, a 4 on the floor, and I say drive, can you do it? Now it's additive transfer. You don't really know how to do it. You're basically back to scratch. You cannot do it. So subtractive transfer easy, additive transfer basically impossible. Why does this matter? Computers, by their very definition, make things easy. That's why they exist. They didn't invent computers to make life harder. So when you learn on a computer, not only do you learn on a narrow context, but you learn in the easiest possible way. Now, when you go out into the real world where things are very varied and complex and always changing, most kids will never be able to move that strategy or skill out. It's additive
Hmm.
transfer. They're back to scratch. And so we've seen it for decades. Teach a kid how to do math on a calculator, ask them to do it with a pen and paper. They can't. But flip
Yeah.
it. If you learn in the real world and move it onto a computer, which is much easier, all of a sudden it's the easiest thing in the world. Kids who learn how to do math by pen and paper, give them a calculator, they can use it just like that because it's subtractive transfer. So, easiest example of this, kids who learn how to handwrite, handwriting fluency correlates almost perfectly with typing fluency. You know how to handwrite. I know how well you are at writing by hand. I can tell you how good of a typer you're going to be. But that's only if you learned to write by hand first. If you learned how to type first, then there is no correlation to handwriting fluency because kids who learn how to type first can't write to save their lives. So now all of a sudden,
Wow.
typing fluency and handwriting fluency are completely dissociated. Why? Because if you learn the harder thing first, move it to the easy context, you're fine. Learn the easy thing first, move into the hard context, you can't do a thing. And so that's the
Wow.
final thing with the tech thing is because tech was built to make life easier. It's a production tool. It's meant for experts to use so they don't have to do as much stuff. When we mistake that as a learning tool and put kids only in the easiest possible environment with all the bells and whistles that make it simple for them, we cannot be shocked when law firms are firing new hires because kids can't actually make an argument without ChatGPT. We can't be confused when over 50% of new hires lose their job in the first 6 months because they don't have the skill set the employer requires because they tied it to a computer, not the real world where the job demands they employ it or the job demands that they use that skill. So you've got multitasking, you've got empathy, and you've got transfer. Those three issues will never be overcome by tech because tech actively works against them at all levels.
I am going to have to go back and literally pull this out, and I think I'm going to just document it and put it on my board to remember this stuff. Because first of all, as a longtime business person working in the business world, I'm I guess shocked and slightly saddened to realize that all the times I put multitasking on my resume, clearly I wasn't, not at all. A highly overrated skill that everyone puts on their resume, right? I was particularly fascinated by the empathy, though, because that I didn't realize you could actually measure it,
Yeah.
and it feels like we've redefined empathy because. And I feel like we do that a lot, unfortunately. And it happens in culture. I get it over time, but it's very unfortunate when you're using something, a word that does have a real meaning and purpose in a way that it doesn't actually add anything
Yeah.
to redefine it.
And the
But the
scary,
transfer,
take that to the next one too. The scarier thing is when you start to redefine terms to match current standards
oh
rather
yeah,
than, and that's my big fear is how people are starting to redefine effective attention to mean multitasking, to mean kids who can jump between six things. Doesn't matter that you stink at it, but we're going to say that that is good attention. We're going to redefine learning to mean kids who can look things up rather than kids who actually know things. And if we're not paying attention, we'll redefine it and we won't know what we lost. The next generation will think they're doing exactly the same thing we are. Oh my goodness, can I give you a good example of this?
you absolutely
Sorry,
can.
sorry. So this one blows my mind. And if you are a human being and breathing, if this doesn't blow your mind, I will check your pulse.
All right.
So think back to like the SATs or all the tests that we had to take in school. We had to do
Mm-hmm,
reading comprehension sections. And the idea
mm-hmm,
was read a passage. Here's 15 questions about it. Let's see what you learned. Cool. That's reading comprehension. This year, the SATs went digital. So 2025 is the first year the SATs are completely digital. Reading
mm.
comprehension this year is here is a single sentence of about 70 words. Here is one question about that sentence. Next. Here's one sentence, one question about that sentence. Next. Kids have 52 single sentences with one question about each. And that is now being defined as reading comprehension. And I'm like, when you ask me, like, dude, that has nothing to do with comprehension. That's nothing like I was trained on. They said, no, it's reading comprehension because kids today don't need to comprehend. They need to be able to skim and extract single points. So we are
Oh,
redefining reading comprehension to mean the extraction of single ideas from short form text. That's a redefinition that our kids will just, because they're being tested on it, will never recognize that that is never what we meant when we said reading comprehension. Yet there it is.
I am legitimately gobsmacked by that. That is horrific
And they're going
because
to
I mean,
renorm that to be equivalent to ours. And it's like, what are you
yeah,
talking about?
just create a different term, like make it
Yep.
something, it's a different skill, skimming or whatever you want to call it, but that is horrific.
Yep.
Oh boy, that is really sad. I think I know that there's a lot of people who have possibly more hope than me for some of the future. I'm not going to lie. I am a little bit of a tin hat afraid of Skynet coming down to get us because of the direction we're going, which is where I thought it was interesting that you talked about AI and technology is never going to be able to replace these various, like the empathy, being able to create that relationship, which I want to come back to. But before I do, because you touched on that concept of handwriting, which is interesting, because I've heard, first of all, I didn't know that it connected to typing. That was very interesting. But I've heard that you learn better, you'll retain and remember certain information better if you handwrite it versus if you type it versus if you just don't do anything at
Yeah.
all. So is that correlation connected, like you were talking about, of handwriting and your ability to type?
Absolutely. So this goes a little bit, it goes beyond what we were just talking about. But what happens is usually we see this when it comes to, say, note taking, right? So you're in a class, you're
Mm-hmm.
taking notes. People who type typically type incredibly fast. They can almost
Mm-hmm.
type as fast as the teacher will speak. So what they do is they end up taking verbatim notes. They become a stenographer. We call it shallow notes. They get every word. They have copious amounts of notes. But if you ask them, hey, what did you just learn today? They will flat out tell you, I don't know. I have to go read my notes. When you're taking shallow notes, these copious amounts of notes, the only thing important to you is the sound and the order of the words. Did I hear it? Did I write it? Did I hear it? Did I write it? The meaning is irrelevant. Compare that to someone who takes notes with a pen and paper. there ain't a human being in the world who can handwrite as fast as I speak. So by definition, if you're taking notes by hand, you already have to be parsing out meaning. You have to be thinking what's important, what's not, what's worth getting down, what's irrelevant. And that's why handwritten notes are so gross. You've got lines and arrows and crosses because you're processing the meaning of what you're hearing. So believe it or not, the typing versus writing, the biggest difference we see is in that note taking. And it has to do with the style of notes you're forced to take when using the tool. Now, remember, again, what I just said, tech makes things easier. Why not get every word down? Analog makes things harder, but the effort is where the learning happens. If you go to the gym and everything is easy, you didn't just work out. If you go to the gym and you're huffing, congratulations, you just did what you had to do. It's no different when it comes to learning.
That is, I have to personally attest to the 100% by golly accuracy of that, because I'm an extremely fast typer, and I often tell people I just like to type the notes as we're doing meetings, etc., because I can type so much faster than I can write. But I definitely do not retain the information the same way. I always lean on it with this idea that, oh, I'll go back and search it, but it's not the same as when you're handwriting. And I remember even being in college or other classes where I'd write something down. I can physically remember where I wrote it on the notebook. It is completely ingrained in my mind.
Extend that. So you just tapped into something that I think is incredibly deep and important. Is one of the biggest aspects of human memory is exactly that. It's space. Three-dimensional location is wildly important to how we make memories. So there's the example I always use is, and I might be dating myself, but there was a video game I used to play growing up called Grand Theft Auto. So I don't know if your listeners have ever heard of this, but there you go. So old video games used to just be linear, like Mario. You just go in a straight line. Grand Theft Auto was the first game where it was just a giant world and you could go anywhere you wanted to in it. And to make sure you never got lost, what they did is they put a little map into the corner of the screen that always told you exactly where you were. Your brain has that map. And every time you learn something new, it becomes stamped with a three-dimensional location. Where in space did this happen? Hard copy books, handwritten documents, these things have unchanging three-dimensional locations. Like, think about this book here in front of me. Till this book burns into dust, the word in is going to be 10% of the way through, left page, top left-hand side. It ain't going nowhere. Now, I read that same thing on a screen, or I've typed my notes and now I've got them all on a computer. The word in will start on the bottom of the screen, scroll through the middle, go out the top. There is no three-dimensional location to it. So an entire aspect of human memory just gets wiped. So this is another reason why reading hard copy versus digital, you'll learn more. Write by hand on paper that stays still versus a screen where you can scroll and open and move, you will learn more because you have this spatial aspect. And you nailed it. Whereas, like you said, I won't always remember what I wrote, but I can start to remember the context it was in, where it was on the page. It's the same thing with readers, avid readers. Very rarely will you remember the exact words you read, but my goodness, you can flip right to that scene in a book. Like it's, oh, there's this action scene. Hold on. It's right. There it is. Bam. You know where it happened. That is a key. You bring space in, memory boosts up. You get rid of space, which tech does. A huge aspect of memory just disappears, unfortunately.
That is absolutely fascinating, because I had that experience and didn't recognize that. I just had no idea that was actually a thing. But it makes a lot of sense. It is really cool. Okay, so we've talked mostly about EdTech right now, just tech in general, touched on AI. Before we officially move to AI or look at that, because I know we're running over, I want to talk real quick about what you cover as the 3 apologies for EdTech. Because I feel like those are going to actually be applied just as much to AI as they have been for general ed tech. So for everyone listening, and I'll let you recap them, but the computers have so much potential, or tech, right? The potential, the ubiquitousness, and that the people, the end users, are using whatever the tech is incorrectly. So I thought that was fascinating. Can you just talk to those a little bit more and what the problems are with that?
Yeah. And for anyone really interested, there's about 9 apologies that you'll hear. So if you're ever the kind of person who's going to push back against tech, there are 9 arguments that everyone comes with. These are kind of the 3 most prominent. But if you want, another time we can lay them out. I'm writing a book now, so they'll be there soon.
I love apologetics for theology. So now I get technology apologetics.
The technology apologists. I love it. So go with the first one, potential. What people will that's the biggest argument everyone makes. Tech has potential to make so many inroads. Tech has potential. That's when you just got to remember potential literally is what something is not. When you say something has potential, you are implicitly telling me what it is not doing. So when I say, yeah, my shoe has potential to go to the moon, what I'm saying is my shoe isn't on the moon yet. So believe it or not, I've got no problem with the potential argument. The issue is potential, what something could do, is never a solid enough basis upon which to make big, important decisions about education. You want to make a decision, don't tell me what it could do, tell me what it is doing. I can only deal with the data that exists now. So if you really want me to embrace your tool, do the research, give me the data, have an independent researcher verify that data, tell me when, where, how it's going to work. Now we can consider plugging it in. As it stands now, they say it has potential, therefore plug it in everywhere, and we just become guinea pigs, figuring out for them that it doesn't really work. We've been doing this for 60 years. It still ain't working. Where's that potential? Dylan William, he's one of the biggest guys in the field of educational research. He says, EdTech is the revolution that's been coming for 50 years. That's how long we've been told it's got potential. How much longer are we supposed to wait? So potential is never going to be a valid argument. Just say, cool, give me the data. Potential sounds neat. What is it actually doing? Which will then bring you into the idea that computers are ubiquitous. And that kind of bleeds into the kids need to be trained on computers to learn to work, or else I will never get a job. Mate, there is so much ubiquitous in this world that schools will never touch. Driving, healthcare, yoga, divorce processes, litigation, how do you do taxes? Schools don't touch these things. Why? Because we realize we're not the only ones here educating kids. We are an aspect of their education, but they got friends, family, peers, context, their society. They're learning from people that aren't us. And a lot of these ubiquitous things are meant to be learned out there. Tech is one of those ubiquitous things that kids are clearly spending 2,500 hours a year on. Do we really need an additional 6 hours at school to teach them anything? But let's pretend we do. Let's pretend somebody says it is ubiquitous. We do need to teach about this tech. That is going to bring us into the difference between curriculum and pedagogy. Curriculum is what we teach. Pedagogy is how we teach. So you can make an argument, we need to teach computers. I'm fine with that, believe it or not. That's a curriculum argument. The problem is most tech people will morph that through some linguistic alchemy into we need to teach all things through a computer. Now it's pedagogy. Now you're telling me how to teach, and now you've crossed a line and it doesn't make sense anymore. So if anyone wants to use it's ubiquitous argument, say, cool, we can have a computer class. I'll have a computer lab. I'll teach coding. That doesn't mean I need to use a computer in writing class, that I need to use a computer in math class or history or gym. What we teach and how we teach are two different things, and how we teach needs to be dictated by the content I'm teaching, not the tool available to me. So that's where I'd say that ubiquity one is going to bleed into, cool, we can still teach about it. Doesn't mean we need to teach everything through it. And for anyone just real quick who says, if you don't train your kids in this stuff, they won't get a job. That is completely 100% backwards. The surest way to make sure your kid is not work ready is to train them on today's tools. Spend the next 2 years training your kid how to use today's tools. Guarantee they will not be ready for the next tool down the pipe. And this is why K through 12 education has never been a tool-based education. It's been a thinking-based education. K through 12 is called a broad education because you learn how to think through knowledge. The idea being, we're training you how to solve problems, how to address issues. That way, when the world changes in a way we can't predict, you know how to adapt. You know how to adjust. That's what we're here training you how to do. Training a kid on AI is like training them how to rent Blockbuster Video in the 90s. Probably was really important back then. What a waste of time today. So believe it or not, if you want a tool-based education, they're called TAFEs. They're called ITs. We have schools that teach you how to do a tool. But a K through 12 general education specifically doesn't do that because we're teaching you how to use all tools. Teach a kid a tool, they'll be good at that tool. Teach a kid how to think, they'll be good at all tools. That's why I like my favorite thing, and sorry to harp on this, I just think it's so dang important. Go to any ed conference, and I promise you there's going to be someone telling you about the importance of AI and how to use it and how as in school and all this stuff. Look at the age of that person. 100% that person is going to be well over 30. So all you got to do is raise your hand and say, excuse me, sir, AI wasn't around when you were in school. How the heck did you ever figure out how to use this tool enough to teach me how to use it? It's because school taught him how to figure out. School taught her how to figure things out. When we teach tools instead of teaching kids how to figure things out, we basically stunt their growth. So, believe it or not, the best way to make sure your kid is future work ready, general, broad education, thinking through knowledge. That's how we learn to adapt. And last but not least, if you go to that, it's all your fault. You're using it wrong. Every inventor of every tool has a specific way how they think it should be used. Alfred Nobel invents dynamite. He says no one will ever use this in war. First thing it does is it's used in war. The guy who invents the TV says no one will ever watch this to do anything but learn. Of course, we use it to just sell things. The intentions of a developer and the actual use or practice of the users are typically two very different things. And at the end of the day, the intentions are totally meaningless. I don't care what you wanted me to do with your tool. It's how are human beings actually using the tool that we need to ask. And we need to say, is that helping? So you could have had all the intentions of the world for your tool to be used only on a Tuesday, doing this to help learning. But if no kid in the world is actually doing that, sorry, it's no longer a valid learning tool. You didn't have control of your device. Now we have to ask, what are they actually doing? Is that harming or helping learning, devoid of intentions? And 9 times out of 10, it's harming learning. Therefore, we got to get rid of it there. So the intention argument kind of is the same as the it has so much potential argument. Cute, but I got to deal in reality, and I just don't have time to deal with what might be someday or what you hope will be someday.
So if tech isn't the tool, which I love that you're saying this, by the way, because especially that last point, in my opinion, it just really, really, it's like the concept of, I was raised with this idea that perception is 90% of reality, whether
Yeah.
or not you meant for something to come out, all roads or the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right?
Yeah.
Like that's exactly how it is. And I thought that's such a good analogy, everything that you listed there, and just the point about it, because that's what we're seeing. I saw that with my kids, and as I've studied this more and found how kids are using these tools and not necessarily using them for the way they should be. So if tech isn't the tool that, or maybe the savior of education that we were told it was going to be, it's probably fair to say that we maybe need some tech, at least some tech in schools. How would you balance? What would that balance look like for you between analog and digital in your ideal classroom?
Just go back to a well, I guess pre new millennia school. There is a computer lab, the same as there's a wood shop lab, the same as there's a art lab. The idea being, if you want to use computers, it becomes a conscious decision. The teacher has to say, okay, I'm going to rent the computer lab during this time. I'm going to get my kids up. I'm going to walk them over. It becomes a very deliberate decision when we use them. So I got no problem having computers in school so long as they are tied to a specific location that requires everyone to think. The way it stands now with one-to-one computing devices and phones in the pockets and all this, it just becomes the default. Because it's there, let's use it. Because I don't have to do any actual deliberation, it's just that, yeah, pull it out, type away. The second you make people think about tech and actually make decisions in their life, I can do A or I can do B. It's not just an automatic, it has to be tech. That's when you start to see people using it very deliberately. We call it tech intentionality. That's totally fine. That's when kids do fine, teachers do fine, because they have a very specific reason to be using tech in that moment, which means the vast majority of time you won't be using it. There's a reason why most high-tech high schools are no longer high-tech. They don't work. The less you play with tech while learning, during that 6-hour day, if you never touched a screen, that'd probably be pretty good for learning. And it has been for centuries, millennia. What am I saying? So in my ideal world, you'd still teach about tech. You would have a tech lab, which makes everything tech intentional, but you would by no means have freely accessible tech that kids can touch when they want to, how they want to, and it's in every classroom, because that's just totally irrelevant. Most teachers, and I would argue with the amount of work I've done, about 70% of teachers I work with are completely over tech. And most of them will have been in the classroom for over 10 years. You talk to any teacher that's been in the classroom for about 2 decades, to a man, they will tell you, my kids are doing worse, they understand less, and they will almost all say it's because of tech. They recognize it, it's just they don't really have a voice to do much about it. So if we can help them as parents on the back end, that's going to be a good thing.
So then if you could have one message go to policymakers and the people in charge and to parents to fight for this, to do something to improve the situation for our students, what would that be?
Step one would be Most states or districts have banned cell phones. Cute. I love it. I think it's a great move. That's just step one. The next inevitable step is you have to legalize opt-in, opt-out. There are so
Mm.
many families who are working so hard right now to digital detox their kids, to make sure that they grow up in an analog world and they interact with actual people. And then they go to school and they're forced to be on a screen for 6 hours, or hand in their homework via email, or can only get access websites to get their. The first thing you got to do is allow opt out. And what you see in a couple of districts, or excuse me, schools were doing this in Australia. When you allow parents to opt out, that requires every teacher, everyone to have both analog and digital versions of anything. Because if you have a parent who says, my kid will not be touching tech, cool, that teacher has to have an analog version of their teaching. The more teachers have to do both analog and digital, the more they realize really quickly that the analog stuff requires them to do more work, but it's always better than the digital stuff. They can guide it better, they can tweak it better, they can make better sense of what kids are doing with it. And within about a year, the majority of teachers will only be doing analog. Because when you force them to do both, they will start to compare it themselves and they'll say, look, if I'm going to put all this work into this and I know this is working better, I'm going to make all my kids do this. So believe it or not, if you just do that opt-in thing, that's going to force people to have to do so much stuff that I think you're going to make a big analog push without much more beyond that. It's not going to solve every problem, but I think that's a really, really powerful first step.
So, do you have time for one more question? I
Of
want
course,
to ask you.
absolutely.
Okay. So I was reading this book, I told you already, from advice, just from trying to see outside of just necessarily my perspective.
Yeah.
And there's this book, Rewiring Education, that talks a lot about the new tech and AI. And one of the things that I thought was actually incredibly sad was this concept, and you touched on this briefly earlier before we started, that AI is going to be able to make all this personalized learning, and it can remove those kind of basic tutoring or the first stages of learning. But then you make such a good point on the importance of empathy. And what I'm also hearing from you here is that ability to tweak in and make changes for the individual learner. So anyway, all that to say, in the book, and this is an argument that I feel like I hear everywhere when it's related both to tech, but especially AI. This idea of all of a sudden teachers are going to be able to do so much more because those basic things are removed. But I don't feel like that is going to be the case. How do we fight against that? What response can our parents have to fight back against this convenience factor that is being pushed? Because to me, I just think it's a sad loss of humanity and connection, and even those memories of going through that learning process, both for the teacher and the student, and that relationship built. I mean, there's just, I don't know, I'm just extremely nostalgic on all of this. It makes me so sad.
But you're nostalgic for the right stuff. Is if you were nostalgic, but all the data said that our schooling sucked, then I'd say you're just being nostalgic. But you're being nostalgic, and all the data says we were doing much, much better. So maybe it's not nostalgia so much as it is recognition that we've made some wrong decisions here. And we got two choices: either continue to dig this hole, sunken cost, or go back. And in this case, I don't consider going back to be a reversion. I consider it to be a fix for the mistakes that we've been making in between. But I hear completely what you're saying. And the danger with that is there is, believe it or not, a kernel of truth in what they're saying. And anytime you have a kernel of truth, that gives you free reign to make anyone believe anything you want. The next time you hear those arguments, just three things to remember. One, transfer issue. Anytime we use tools and AI and computers to personalize learning, we hit a massive transfer issue. So believe it or not, personalized learning, this idea of using computers and software to give kids exactly what they need, exactly when they need it. The very first computerized tool was built in 1929. And it never took off. Why? Because we have a letter from the guy. He's Sidney Pressey. He wrote a letter to B.F. Skinner to say why it never took off. He said, because the kids would fly on the machine. As soon as I asked them the same exact question verbatim off the machine, they weren't able to do it. Or if they give them something similar somewhere else, they just could not do it. So the transfer issue becomes huge. No matter how good the tech is doing, you're sticking kids with tech if they have to use the tech. Beyond that, then you could say, okay, the kernel of truth then comes in here, where we do have data that shows personalized, what we call adaptive training
Mhm.
works. You can improve skills that way. But the two things to know there is, one, you can only improve very shallow skills. So you can use adaptive tutoring to, say, improve your spelling or maybe your arithmetic. As soon as you need to go deeper with it and actually use arithmetic in a problem, it is now no longer any good. And now you need to fit words into a coherent sentence that means something. Now you can't do anything good. So it's really good at that kind of surface level. Will stick you there. But again, most kids will get stuck on it. So now you hit the transfer issue. Kids will do well on the program. And so long as we're scoring the program, it says, looks like you're doing better, better, better. As soon as you take them off the program, you won't see those gains. They'll start to disappear. So it can work in one sense, and that's where I think the AI people are bringing it up. But I think that's going to bring you to that third aspect, the empathy aspect. One of the biggest things we've discovered in education research, I would argue, in the last 50 years, and it is so painfully obvious that I can't believe we didn't see it much sooner, is what is the benefit of things like feedback? What is the benefit of things like testing, of giving pop quizzes? What is the benefit of asking kids questions? For the longest time, we assumed the benefit was to the student. When I give you feedback, you've learned something about yourself. When you take a test, you've learned something about what you know. And to be fair, it does help them. But by far, the biggest impact of all that stuff is on the teacher. When the teacher gives a kid feedback, it changes the way the teacher teaches that kid. When the teacher asks a question, depending on how the kids respond, they change their teaching tactics. We are highly responsive individuals, which is always my favorite joke, is everyone says tech is so good because it's adaptive. You know who else is adaptive? Humans. We are wickedly adaptive, and we are far better adaptive because it's not just answers. We can read body language. We can read size. We can read the sound of somebody's voice, the tone of the inflection of their question. Teachers are so wickedly adept at adjusting their teaching to meet where students are at. That's the biggest impact of all these things. So when a computer comes out and says, I can ask you 100 questions and get you really good at it, I might only need to ask you 10 questions. It's not the questions that were important. It was the feedback the teacher was getting from asking that question that allowed them to maneuver that kid as needed to that next level. And that's where empathy comes from. You can only really start to find these moves when kids and teachers empathize together. You cannot get it from a bunch of ones and zeros on a screen. So you can see there's a nugget of truth. Hard drilling on one topic can work. It just becomes highly narrow, non-transferable. It will only ever stay on the surface. You can't do deep stuff with it. And it will always eliminate a teacher who can make it so much easier. Which, by the
Mhm.
way, I will say that, so all the data that shows that doing that kind of intelligent tutoring stuff works, if you do what we call moderators, what's making it work better or worse? If you do that kind of work with a teacher present, it always works so much better than if you do that work alone. If you send a kid home to do that little computer stuff, they almost learn nothing. You do that with a teacher there watching you, and you start to see it's not the questions, it's the teacher. It has always been the teacher. We learn from each other, not from things, unfortunately.
That is really encouraging because I think that while this has been a painful journey, and I think we're going to go through a little bit more pain, unfortunately, for before people really wake up. But I have hope. I genuinely do have hope because I think that people are seeing how tech, in general, is not as wonderful as we thought it was going to be in this in technology saturated world. I think I'm going to have to call you to see if maybe we can, again, for another special conversation about AI in schools, especially the getting into like emotional connections and like guidance counselor, like, but I'll save that for another conversation because I think that could go really long. But
I love that you're thinking about this, and anytime you want, I'm all yours.
yeah, I do. Are you doing any more research in this area? Because you have so much clearly unpacked with the idea of, and that empathy part just gets me. Have you unpacked that at all?
My research, I'm not in a lab right now, so I'm not doing any research myself, but I'm synthesizing. I'm now in the enviable spot where I'm recognized enough by researchers as a guy who knows his stuff that I pretty much am now seen as the hub. So as
Oh,
research comes down the pipe, a lot of it gets funneled through me. So I kind of have my finger on the pulse. So I might not be doing it, but I know what's going on. So it helps me really make these arguments faster, which is good.
Well, to lay people like me, that's still research because I'm not doing either of those pieces. I'm just talking to wonderful people like you who can break it down and help me understand. So, all right. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share? Anything that we didn't get to cover?
I just say
And if
keep it up. The first domino was cell phones, and 10 years ago, people said there's no way you're getting that out of people's hands. We did it. So the next step is going to be EdTech. It's going to be laptops, one-to-one computers. The journey is just beginning, but we've proven that we can make a difference. So just keep it up.
I agree. I do. I know I jokingly said that I don't have hope, but I do. I do have hope. I think we're going to get there. And with people fighting like you, I know that, and uncovering more details and showing us the importance of it, because this was is very helpful. I can't wait for to be able to feature this and for people to watch your video. I've had, as we did, I'll cut this out of the recording, but as we were getting you fully approved, I had multiple people on our panel that does the like reviewing of our resources. They're like, "Oh my
Yeah.
God, I had no idea. This is incredible." So,
That's
um,
awesome. That's
yeah,
I
you're
think I think
definitely
people
helping.
are I think the data is there. I just think it's not many people can explain why, the
Yeah.
mechanisms. And that's where I think I'm if once people see the mechanisms, they say, "Oh, so it's not just a number, there's a reason for it." And if we know the reason, then we can push back against. So that's why I think people are happy. If I can be the mechanism guy, that makes my day.
Well, you talk about teaching the why, right?
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that's part of this for me anyway. It's,
Yeah.
oh, that's why. Okay, that makes sense. So,
Like you
where
said, you
can
were having
people
those
find you?
connections with your own life where you were saying, "Oh, is that why when I was taking notes?" You see it, you understand the mechanism and see an example in your own, then you don't forget it. Then for the
Nope.
rest of your days, you're like, "Okay, there's more to now I can actually
Oh yeah.
take agency over this idea." I love that.
That it definitely, I seriously, that has been, I love learning. So this is just always one of my most favorite things to do, be able to talk to people like you. But if people can't talk to you, where can they find you to learn all of the cool stuff that you have to
Oh,
share?
if you guys, so we have a website called lmeglobal.net. So that's learning made easy, LME Global. I have a YouTube channel, Jared Cooney Horvath, I think is just the name of the YouTube channel, where I put out learning videos. That's where we take a look at new research and say, paper just came out a couple weeks ago. What does it mean? What does it mean for us as parents, as teachers, as students? And like I said, I got a new book coming out called The Digital Delusion. I think it'll be out in December, but I don't know. But that's the book which gets all the data and mechanisms together to say, here's what we need to push back against schools. It's like the playbook we need as parents to say, enough with this ed tech stuff. Here's why we're pushing back and what we can do.
And when you said that's coming out in December?
December 7th, I think, is the official release
Nice.
date.
Oh,
Ooh,
all
fingers
right.
crossed. We'll see.
Maybe, maybe we'll have you back for our book club then too. Another reason to talk.
Oh, I
Sounds
love it. I'm all yours.
nice. All right. Well, thank you so much. It has been wonderful talking to you. This has been an absolutely delightful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today. I wish that this information was taught in schools. Kids are always asking why, so it's kind of surprising that we don't tell them. And while I'm not saying that every student will feel this way, I do think many would benefit from knowing why they need this analog world, why they need to handwrite notes instead of just typing or not listening, why multitasking does not help them learn. The biggest takeaway here, quite frankly, is simple. Technology isn't always the answer. Now, I'm pretty sure you know this, but the fact is that sometimes the best learning happens with paper, pencils, or pens, and a caring teacher who knows your child's name. If you're wondering how to advocate for better learning in your school, start by asking questions, demand the evidence, and when you're told that tech will solve all problems, remember that relationships always matter more than screens. And don't forget, change is possible. 10 years ago, no one thought we could get cell phones out of schools, but here we have. We have done that. Well, in many states, and I'm pretty sure it's going to happen even more. The next step now is making sure our kids have the option to learn in analog ways too, going completely digital free if that is what we as parents want for them. So keep pushing, keep asking, and keep fighting for what's best for our kids. If you want to learn more about Dr. Horvath and his work, you can check it out at his website, lmeglobal.net, and of course his YouTube channel, which will be linked in the show notes. And don't forget, keep an eye out for his upcoming book, The Digital Delusion. And as always, please like and subscribe to hear more from us when new content's released. Share this episode with your friends, your school board, and frankly, anyone who wants to see our kids thrive, which hopefully is everybody. Thanks for joining us at M4L Academy. As James Madison said, The advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only true guardian of liberty, which, of course, is the mission of M4L Academy. And so, until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep fighting for what's best for our kids. Class dismissed.